everybody, I'm Alexis. Welcome to my channel. Okay, so my ISFP husband is not here to adjust my lighting system, so I just opted for no lights. I don't know how it's working. I had it on, it was way too bright, and whatever. So I want to talk about Fe Polr in this video. And this is something that I wasn't able to consciously recognize in myself for a long time. People that have Fe in the top 4 spots can really easily point out a lack of Fe and how it's hindering someone else's life. But I think those of us that don't have Fe in the top 4 spots, we don't really understand why that would be limiting in our lives. And I still actually don't really fully feel like it's limiting my life very much. I think what we can do is we can make kind of a conglomerate with other functions that we do have in our top 4 spots, and we can kind of turn it into Fe that way. I'm not sure exactly which functions those are, but I think we can get by even with that weakness by utilizing other strengths. But even with that being said, I do want to talk about what those weaknesses are, what that is, how that shows up, what I've noticed in my life, what I've been able to pick up. So if you have Fe Polr, it automatically means that you have Fi in the 3rd slot. So that means this is INTJs and ISTJs that have Fe Polr. And if you look at INTJs and ISTJs, they do give off a similar affect. It is cold. And I want to be very specific by what I mean by cold. I don't mean that they seem mean and they don't seem like they don't have emotions. You can tell that like on the inside they do. But what I mean by they're cold, I just mean that they're not warm. They're not inviting. They only smile when they genuinely think something, like they only smile and laugh when they genuinely think something is funny. They're not fake. And I think that's how I would phrase it, being someone that has Fe Polr, is it's not fake. If I'm laughing, you know that I actually think something's funny. And I'm not trying to give off a bad affect by not smiling as often or by not laughing as often. I just generally don't think to do it. It's not something I ever do on purpose. And it wasn't until I was watching some other video where they pointed out that INTJs only laugh when they really think something's funny. They only smile when they're like genuinely really happy at that moment about something. And I was like, oh, is that not normal? I mean, and then when I started thinking about ENFJs and ESFJs, I was like, oh yeah, they're smiling literally all the time, regardless of the circumstance. They laugh way more often. They will chuckle way more often. This is what I always thought. I thought that I had a higher standard for humor than most people. And I was like, you know what? I think other people are just kind of dumb, and that's why they think more things are funny, so they laugh more. But now thinking about that, I'm like, no, I don't think that people actually think more things are funny than I do. I think they just are willing to laugh more often, even if it's not 100% genuine, for the sake of giving off a good, warm, inviting vibe to the people around them. And I'm never thinking about that. I just was listening to some IFJs, and they were talking about how when they're in a bad mood, they will purposely not be around people because they don't want to poison the atmosphere. And I never think about that. You know, when I'm in a bad mood, I also don't want to be around people, but I don't think of it for the reason of poisoning the atmosphere. I just think of it like, I'm in a bad mood, I'm in Fi, I want to deal with it on my own. Or sometimes when I'm in a bad mood, I will want to go talk it out with another Fi user, or I will want to go to an Fe user for comfort. Most of the time I want to deal with it by myself, but I'm never thinking of poisoning the atmosphere. I'm just like, you know what, I'm having this real emotional thing, and I want to get it dealt with. And I don't know, I never think about it in terms of the other person. And that's one thing that I think is a big difference between Fi and Fe. A couple differences. Fi is about the emotions going on the inside. And it's particularly bent toward the negative, darker emotions. Let's really dive deep into that and the dark motivators of humanity. Whereas Fe is much more externally oriented. It's the warm, inviting, the smiles that bring people in. And it also is much more oriented toward the positive emotions. To INTJs, that makes it seem like Fe users are fake. That's how I've seen it for a long time. I'm like, they're really fake. They don't want to get into deep subjects. They just want to talk about small talk and keep everything light and fluffy. And that's my perception of it. The strength of keeping things light and fluffy, like when I think about it, like I'm a teacher, and when I think about some of the teachers that are Fe users, they are putting like stars on the top of papers, or they're the ones who've got like the stickers or the smelly stamps or whatever, especially at the elementary level. And I never think to do stuff like that. I never think to write great job. It's like INTJs never think to say positive things for some reason. Like if I'm grading something, I mark the ones that are wrong and I just leave the rest. And it's kind of like, just because it's from it's an efficiency standpoint. It's like you're probably going to get less wrong than you're going to get right. And so it's faster to mark the ones that are wrong. That's what a lot of people do. And give feedback on the ones that are wrong so you can get better on the improvement note. And I don't know. I'm not very good with the positive reinforcement. That is a skill that I'm consciously trying to learn. Positive reinforcement. Don't just focus on the negatives. Don't just criticize. When things are good, point them out. Give compliments. That's something that's so difficult for me. Another thing that I've noticed is it is so difficult to express that I care about people. To me, it is like the most vulnerable thing to call someone my friend for some reason. And that seems so drastic. It's vulnerable to call someone a friend. It's vulnerable to say I care about them. It's a little bit easier in romantic partnerships just because they're close and that's kind of like more of an FI space. I mean, FI is very like vulnerable and intimate. But when it just comes to like friends and kind of that FE social space, it's difficult for me to let someone know like, hey, I care about you. I love eating lunch with you every day. And when I started thinking about that, it probably is difficult for people to know, like, are we friends? Like, I might consider someone my best friend, but I'm never going to tell them that. Like, that feels just like really, that feels really out of the comfort zone to tell someone that. One thing when I was thinking about that I'm jealous of EFJs for is it's like they have deposited so many positive social tokens. Like, I guess in the social economy, they've deposited so many tokens that by the time they want something, like let's say we're in a group gathering and they're like, I want to play the board game Life or whatever. And to me, I'm like, I do not want to play the board game Life. But the ESFJ can get everyone on board. And it's like if I have a game that I wanted to play, for example, first off, the types of games we want to play are just going to be different in general. So it's going to be difficult to get people to want to play our types of games. And then second off, even if it was a good game, let's say just objectively that the group liked, it was going to be so difficult for us to get people to want to play it just to like muster up a group. We can TE and like if people were working for us, we could officially be like, hey, you do this, you do this, you do this. But in a sense of like the social setting, like we're not their boss. And so you can't just command people to do things. So in that sense, it's like, what's the use of TE in this social situation? Whereas FE, it just gets people to do things without even asking. Like, people just listen to FE. And I am just not able to manipulate a group like that. I don't even know how I would begin to manipulate someone else's emotions. Like if they were sad and I wanted to make them feel better, I do not even know how I would go about doing that. I never tried to do that. I'm never thinking of doing that. If someone comes to me and they're sad, I would get into a few functions. I would be like, in my mind, I would be like, okay, TE, how can we solve this problem? And I was like, how can we solve the problem long term? Okay, it's probably the best to get to the root of this thing. So if we can FI and NI dig, get to the root of this thing, really expand on it, figure out the depths of the emotion, talk about it for like an hour, and then maybe the problem can be solved for life. That's kind of my ideals. That's how I like to deal with emotions. You just get in, you drill very, very deep, get to the root cause, and then you never have to deal with it again. But you do have to set aside like an hour to do that. Whereas an FE user, just with their body language and I'll make you some tea and stuff like that, it's just like, I don't know, people just feel cared for. And I don't think people would feel cared for by an INTJ like that. Definitely, like not in the warm sense. Another thing is my jokes sometimes are way off the mark. And I do not realize until afterward. It's, with my jokes, it's always when it's too late. And to me, they don't seem off the mark. To me, I'm just like, oh, it's fine. But then I say them and they're just way too bad. Especially. Let's say I'm with, like in my work situation, 2 ESFJs and an ESFP and me. And they will dabble. They'll just kind of joke. They'll do a slightly dark humor joke and they'll kind of back and forth, dark humor. And I just like plummet it. And they will just like look at me and I'm like, that was not going to fly in this group. I really just should know that. I should know by now that sort of stuff does not fly in this group. But so I'll come home and I will start telling my husband, he's like, oh, I see where this is going. And he was like, you always take it too far. Always too far. See, I want to give an example, but I just feel so embarrassed about the examples. I mean, I'll give one example and just know it's terrible. I don't even know if I can do it. It's just terrible. It's a terrible example. Another thing is that our jokes can come off like when people are joking, people like tease each other or whatever. But when we tease people, our face is not showing a smile, and our tone of voice is not showing that it's joking, and it's very dry, or at least in my instance it is, and it actually comes off very rude. And actually, people have said to me, they're like, I thought that you didn't even like your husband. And I'll be like, oh, what made you think I didn't like him? Like, what happened? And they will recount a joke to me, and they're like, you said this thing, and I was like, oh no, yeah, that was a joke. Which my husband finds funny, and I told my husband what the joke was, and he thought it was hilarious. But I was like, shoot, people, this is actually affecting the way people think, like, my husband and I's relationship is, because people think I'm just saying rude things, but it's 100% a joke. Also, what sometimes happens is I will say like a semi-dark joke. It's it's like not even very dark joke. It's just like a semi-dark joke, and people won't get it and so then in my mind I'm like, oh, you know what I need to do? I need to even exaggerate it more because they didn't get it. And they think that was serious. And I'm like, that's bad if they think that's serious. So I was like, I'll just push it a little further so they know it's a joke. So then I push it further, and then they even still are like, and then it registers in my mind. It's like, no, they got it. They just didn't think it was funny. It was already too dark from the beginning. So I'm like, okay, well. So sometimes I just think we just don't, with the tone of voice and the facial expressions and the content of the joke. There are just all sorts of issues with joke telling from us, I think. I think that INTJs, or anyone with FI, is warm on the inside, and anyone with FE is warm on the outside. So if you're warm on the outside, you're going to be smiling and laughing and hugging and, just doing warm sort of things to make people feel good. So it can come off that like ISTJs and INTJs are cold because we're not showing those sorts of outward displays, but we do have a lot of emotions on the inside. We have FI. It's in that third spot, which is a very vulnerable, childish spot. And so we do have quite sensitive emotions on the inside. We're not necessarily very warm and expressing positive things on the outside, but on the inside there are deep negative things, like big questions going on. One thing that is so rough is I cannot fake my mood at all. If I want to put off a good vibe, or if I want to, like, if I'm kind of upset, but it's not the right time to express it, and I'm like, I just need to get through this event, I just cannot fake it. And that is one of the most difficult things. I think other personalities can fake it so much better, but I think with that pure childish FI or whatever, we just cannot fake it. We're just authentic to the core, I guess, meaning that, like, what you see is what you get. So I was trying to look up some things that EFJs are really good at, and that was another way that I could kind of trigger some things that I'm not good at. One thing is that EFJs are really good at making people belong. They themselves can fit in very well, and in fact, they're kind of like leading the whole group. They're very good at making others fit in, and that is kind of like the sore point for INTJs, and I think ISTJs, is we just don't feel like we fit in. I think in social groups, I have been in a position where I just feel like I'm kind of tagging along or like not really fitting in. And it's just a difference of different interests and understanding group emotional dynamics, Another thing is that if you notice, like ESFJs or any personality with FE, they tend to do a lot of crowdsourcing of information. Like they'll go on Reddit, hey, what do you think of this? Or some like ESFJs, they'll go on Facebook and be like, hey, can you recommend the best doctor or whatever. FE users are a lot better at giving help and asking for help and involving other people in the process. FE is very group oriented, and I think INTJs can be too independent to feel like we have to go it alone. And this whole like INTJ versus like FE sort of thing reminds me of the quote that's like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that kind of illustrates kind of a difference between like the INTJ philosophy and the FE philosophy. I think we just, with that childish FI, we just like really don't trust people in general. And by the same token, FI can make us prideful in combination with the TE. It gives a sense of pride, like, wow, we're better than everyone else. So since we don't trust people and we think that our skills are better than everyone else's, it makes us do things very independently. And that's one way to do it, but one good thing about having mentors or teachers or being in school is you get feedback. You could go through school and do all these assignments, but if you never get feedback, like on what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, you wouldn't really be learning. It's the feedback process. You like input and then you output and you get feedback, and you input and you output and you get feedback. And I think FE understands that, whereas when you do go the independent route, you're not getting that feedback. Now, we do have other functions that can help us with this, so that's one reason to get into TE, is because TE creates output, and then you can get some feedback, churn it in with NI, output again with TE, get some feedback. Anyways, that's helpful. One thing that FE really understands is context. Like, there are certain social contexts where certain topics of conversation are appropriate, and other conversations where you don't. And at this event, you bring flowers, and at this event, you don't, and stuff like that. Whereas I think FI users just kind of want to be authentic. Like, if there's a thought or emotion that pops up in the moment, they want to be able to just say it, and they don't really give a rip about the context. They just want everyone to be authentic, and we don't care about the social rules or the social niceties. And so if someone, like, for example, if someone jokingly says an offhanded comment that gets into topics that interest me, like philosophy or morals or politics or stuff like that, I've noticed that, like, I just don't care what the social context is. If someone brings up something, I will just go right at it. And pretty soon, you know, the topic is, like, derailed because I think there are, like, social pressures, and then people feel like, no, this is not the appropriate time to talk about that. Whereas INTJs don't care. Like, I don't care if there's an appropriate time to talk about it. Like, if there are two of us and we want to talk about it, then let's talk about it, and I don't care what the social context is. But I think one thing about that third spot, FI, is that in arguments, it can make us a little prideful or misalign our identity with our arguments. And because that Fe Polr is there, it means that we can become combative to the point where if someone is kind of challenging our morals and we feel passionately about it, we're not really holding punches. Like, we're going to really cut to the point. Part of that is just TE wants to get from point A to point B as quick as possible. And it's slower when you're working around, you know, feelings. And that would be the reason that we're not really thinking about it. And finally, the last thing is I think that it just can make INTJs kind of cynical or nihilistic. When a lot of people describe the meaning of life, or like if FE users describe the meaning of life, they're like, it's to help people or to love on people or to help the next generation. And they have these big philanthropic purposes, whereas we don't have the sense of FE. So none of those things seem as fulfilling. That sounds really awful to say. That can make us much more nihilistic because we're going to have that FI bent with the negative emotions anyways. And if we don't have the FE, we're not really thinking about those sorts of things. And it can just make us cynical and nihilistic. And we're like, well, what is the point if so many life purposes are going to be defined by that? Which, if you're interested in that topic, I have a video on life purpose, which I actually found to be very helpful. And I think about that concept daily now. I have an INTJ social skills video, and I feel like that is kind of the answer to this problem. So I think sometimes people say, like, oh, because of our polar FE, we have bad social skills. But I actually feel like in our top 4 cognitive functions, we have all the pieces that we need, if we would use them correctly, to be relatively good in social skills. I mean, we have the same cognitive functions as, like, ESFPs, who I think do much better than us socially. And it's not that we should become ESFPs, but it's just to say that we have the tools to our advantage, that if we need to turn it on for a 5-minute conversation, I think that's well within our means to be able to turn it on for 5 minutes. But yeah, in short, I would just say tap into that SE presence, really be present with someone, give them the eye contact. I've found that eye contact is huge, something I wasn't really aware of, but eye contact turns out is huge, to just be present so that you don't feel like you're acting. Whenever you are acting, that's going to come off robotic. So you have to just be yourself and be present. It's going to be vulnerable, like FI vulnerable, to be yourself when you're around people that you don't trust. So it's important to be around people you trust. It's important to be around people that are secure themselves. In my experience, that's the most secure people I've met are people significantly older than me. So I hang out with people that are like 20 years older than me. You have to, you know, FI, get in touch with your feelings. You have to TE, extrovert those thoughts. And then NI, just get curious about people. NI is really good about getting curious and wanting to know about other people. But in addition to, you know, asking questions about the other person needs to be like 50-50. So for 50% of the information they give you, you need to match that. So yeah, watch that video on INTJ social skills. I think it'll be really helpful. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.